You're standing in a quiet North Carolina farm field, directly above the remains of a hydrogen bomb. No monument. No crater. Just wet soil, scattered trees, and a weapon hundreds of times more powerful than Hiroshima, still partly buried beneath your feet. By the end, you'll know how 2 thermonuclear bombs fell on North Carolina, why one came terrifyingly close to detonating, and what the government left underground. But first, you have to enter the farm while ignoring every invisible danger zone around you. The road outside Goldsboro looks ordinary. Flat farmland. Drainage ditches. Pine trees bending slightly in the wind. If you didn't know the coordinates, you could drive past without ever slowing down. But you do know. So you leave the road and mentally erase the modern world around you. The power lines disappear. The distant traffic fades. The field becomes darker, emptier, and suddenly it is January 24, 1961. You picture the danger zones first. One surrounds the place where a parachute lowered a hydrogen bomb into the earth. Another marks the violent impact of a second weapon. A third exists only in government surveys, an underground boundary around material too difficult to recover. There is no radiation apocalypse waiting in the grass. The bombs did not produce nuclear detonations, and the site is not an open-air death trap. The danger is historical, because the peaceful field conceals how narrow the margin really was. In 1961, the United States kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air as part of its Cold War alert system. The logic was brutally simple. If Soviet missiles destroyed American air bases, bombers already airborne could still retaliate. That meant aircraft flew over American towns carrying live thermonuclear weapons. Not replicas. Not training devices. Actual bombs. And above this patch of North Carolina, one of those aircraft began to die. Shortly after midnight, a B-52 Stratofortress was returning toward Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. During an aerial refueling attempt, its crew learned the aircraft was losing fuel rapidly. Tens of thousands of pounds of jet fuel vanished within minutes. The bomber was directed toward a holding pattern while the crew tried to control it. But the imbalance became extreme. The aircraft rolled. Its structure failed. At roughly 9,000 feet, the B-52 tore apart. 5 crewmen ejected or escaped and survived. 3 died. And in the breaking fuselage were 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each with an explosive yield of approximately 3.8 megatons. As the aircraft disintegrated, both weapons fell toward the farms below. But they did not fall the same way. The first bomb behaved almost exactly as its designers intended. Its parachute deployed. Imagine seeing it from below, a pale canopy opening in the darkness, carrying a 12-foot thermonuclear weapon gently toward the earth. It drifted down slowly enough to catch in a tree, then settled nose-first into the soft ground. The weapon was nearly intact. The second bomb had no such graceful descent. Its parachute did not deploy. It struck a muddy field at enormous speed and buried itself deep beneath the surface. The impact shattered components and drove wreckage downward into waterlogged earth. So now the recovery teams faced 2 completely different scenes. At one location, a hydrogen bomb hung almost politely beneath a parachute. At the other, military crews stared into a flooded excavation pit, searching for fragments of a weapon designed to erase a city. Heavy equipment arrived. Soil was removed. Pumps fought groundwater. Investigators collected pieces from the mud. Much of the second bomb was recovered, but not all of it. The excavation became increasingly difficult and dangerous. Eventually, officials stopped digging. The government purchased an easement over a small portion of the land, restricting deep excavation in the affected area. That detail transforms the entire story. Because the United States did not simply drop 2 nuclear bombs over its own territory. It recovered one, and left part of the other behind. But the buried material was not the part that came closest to destroying North Carolina. That was the weapon beneath the parachute. For years, the public was reassured that multiple safety systems had prevented disaster. The basic message was comforting: yes, the accident looked terrible, but the bombs were never truly close to exploding. Then investigators examined the weapon's internal sequence. And the comforting version began to collapse. A thermonuclear bomb does not normally explode just because it hits the ground. That is important. Its conventional explosives must fire in an extremely precise pattern, compressing nuclear material under carefully controlled conditions. The weapon also includes safeguards intended to prevent accidental arming and detonation. The Mark 39 carried several such protections. But during the breakup over Goldsboro, the descending bomb started moving through parts of its normal attack sequence. The aircraft's destruction produced conditions that resembled an intentional release. The bomb separated from the bomber. Its parachute deployed. Internal systems changed state. Declassified records later indicated that several steps necessary for a nuclear detonation had occurred. The bomb did not understand that the aircraft was crashing. It only understood signals. And those signals looked disturbingly similar to a real bombing mission. This is where official language becomes slippery. A weapon can be described as safe because it did not explode. Investigators can point to every component that remained in the correct position. Engineers can emphasize redundancy. But those statements answer the wrong question. The question is not whether the bomb exploded. You already know it didn't. The question is how many safeguards failed, and what remained between an ordinary North Carolina farm and a multi-megaton nuclear blast. One later assessment, written by Sandia National Laboratory's engineer Parker Jones, was devastating. Jones studied nuclear weapon accidents and the behavior of their safety systems. His conclusion was that one simple, low-voltage switch had prevented the bomb from completing the detonation process. One switch. Not an impenetrable wall of independent protections. Not a flawless machine calmly rejecting every false signal. A single electrical barrier inside a weapon falling through a disintegrating aircraft. And if you think that switch makes the story less frightening, look closer. Its safety depended on the exact kind of electrical separation that a violent crash could threaten. This is the moment most retellings rush toward, the claim that North Carolina was one switch away from annihilation. But before we get to what that actually means, you need to understand something even stranger. The bomb that came closest to detonating was not the mangled weapon buried in the mud. It was the one that landed gently. The parachute may have protected it from impact, while also allowing its internal sequence to continue with less damage. The safer descent preserved the machine. And the preserved machine behaved more like a weapon on a mission. There is another complication. The phrase, "one switch away," is dramatic, but nuclear accidents attract competing interpretations. Some experts emphasize that additional parts of the firing sequence were not completed. Official accounts have sometimes described the weapon's safeguards as functioning successfully. That disagreement matters. But it does not erase the internal assessment. Parker Jones gave his report a title that stripped away the bureaucratic reassurance. Goldsboro Revisited, or How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb. And inside that record was the detail that changed the story: the arm-safe switch was found in a safe position. Everything depended on it staying there. Now zoom out. The bomb's estimated yield was 3.8 megatons. That is about 250 times the explosive yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, depending on the figures used for comparison. If it had detonated at full yield, the first effect would have been a fireball, an expanding sphere of unimaginable heat consuming the immediate area. Then came the blast wave. Buildings would collapse. Windows would shatter across a vast distance. Debris would become shrapnel. People outside the central zone would suffer burns before understanding that anything had happened. The exact destruction would depend on detonation height, weather, terrain, and whether the burst occurred in the air or near the surface. A ground-level explosion could pull enormous quantities of soil into the radioactive cloud, creating severe fallout downwind. Goldsboro was close. So was Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Communities across eastern North Carolina would have faced devastation, panic, contamination, and evacuation on a scale the country had never experienced. Prevailing winds could have carried fallout far beyond the blast region. Models differ, and any precise casualty number would depend on assumptions made decades afterward. But the central fact does not require exaggeration. A full thermonuclear detonation on American soil would have transformed the Cold War overnight. The government would need to explain why a United States bomber had destroyed part of the United States with an American bomb. The Soviet Union might question whether the explosion signaled an attack, a failed mission, or the beginning of something larger. Military radar stations would detect the flash and shock. Commanders would have minutes to interpret incomplete information. The physical blast would be catastrophic. The political aftershock could be worse. And all of it rested on a switch small enough to hold in your hand. Here is the answer the field refuses to give you. The Goldsboro bomb did not detonate because the arm-safe switch remained in the safe position. The weapon had separated from the aircraft. Its parachute had deployed. Parts of the arming sequence had progressed. But the final electrical path required for nuclear firing was not completed. The switch held, and North Carolina remained on the map. That is the payoff, but it is not the end of the danger. The accident exposed a deeper flaw in Cold War thinking. Leaders had built a system that demanded nuclear weapons remain constantly ready for use, then trusted mechanical and electrical safeguards to distinguish war from catastrophe. Usually, those safeguards worked. But usually is a terrifying word when one failure can erase a city. Goldsboro was not the only American nuclear accident. Bombs were lost, burned, crushed, and dropped in incidents across several countries. The military called serious accidents involving nuclear weapons, broken arrows. The phrase sounds almost poetic. It describes aircraft crashes, accidental releases, fires, and lost weapons that could have contaminated, or potentially destroyed, the places they landed. And Goldsboro remains one of the clearest warnings because the chain of events was so ordinary. A fuel leak. An unstable aircraft. A structural failure. Electrical signals moving through a machine. No saboteur. No enemy missile. No madman reaching for a red button. Just equipment failing during a routine mission. When you stand over that farm in your imagination, you are not standing at the site of an impossible disaster. You are standing at the site of a disaster that followed the logic of the system built to prevent one. The bomb fell. The sequence advanced. The switch stayed safe. That was the margin. Return to the second impact site. The military recovered major portions of the weapon, including its plutonium-bearing nuclear capsule. That point matters because loose descriptions can make it sound as if a complete, armed hydrogen bomb remains underground. It does not. What remained unrecovered was buried weapon material associated with the secondary stage, left at depth after water and unstable soil made further excavation impractical. The government established restrictions over the small affected parcel to prevent deep digging. Above it, the landscape returned to agriculture. Seasons passed. Crops grew. Roads changed. People moved in and out of nearby homes. The most dangerous part of the story became invisible. That invisibility is why forgotten events survive so easily. A ruin invites questions. A memorial provides a date. A crater announces that something happened. A field says nothing. Documents had to speak for it. Records released years later sharpened what officials had once softened. Journalists and researchers pieced together technical language, safety assessments, and recovery reports. The result is not evidence of a successful cover-up in which nobody knew. It is something more believable. The facts were divided among technical files, cautious statements, classified details, and reassuring summaries. Each fragment sounded manageable on its own. Only when you placed them together did the shape become visible. 2 hydrogen bombs fell over North Carolina. One buried itself so deeply that part of it was abandoned. The other moved far enough through its arming logic that an engineer later warned a single switch prevented catastrophe. And for everyone sleeping nearby, there was no warning at all. The real secret of Goldsboro is not that the United States nearly lost control of a bomb. It is that losing control was built into the arithmetic. To guarantee retaliation, bombers had to remain airborne. To remain credible, they had to carry live weapons. To be useful, those weapons had to arm reliably when released. Every requirement pushed the system closer to readiness, and readiness pushed it closer to accidental use. That contradiction sat inside the aircraft before the fuel leak ever began. You were told nuclear deterrence depended on perfect control. Goldsboro shows something colder. Deterrence often depended on accepting a small probability of catastrophe, then repeating the risk until small stopped feeling small. Thousands of missions. Countless mechanical components. Exhausted crews. Violent weather. Fuel lines, switches, wires, and human decisions. The miracle is not that one bomber broke apart. The miracle is that the switch held when it did. Today, the farm is quiet. There is no mushroom cloud burned into the horizon. No abandoned city. No national day of mourning. History records what happened because the bomb failed to finish what it had started. You can stand near that landscape, hear wind moving across the field, and recognize the most disturbing truth of all. The world did not survive Goldsboro because the system was incapable of failure. It survived because one final component did not fail at the wrong moment. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next time, Britain tested anthrax on Groenland Island for decades, the story of an island deliberately contaminated by biological warfare, then left under quarantine while officials tried to prove it was safe.